Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new edition of the Daily Debate. In tonight's show, we're going to be focusing on the Syrian crisis. We're going to be talking about Egypt's stance regarding this file that's been going on really for about 10 years. This is in light of the participation of Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry with the small virtual group of ministerial meeting that included Egypt, Germany, the UK, the US, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and France. We're going to be talking about this file tonight, but before we do so, let's check out some of the main stories making the news today. And we start off with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who ordered the modernization and digitalization of the National Social Insurance Authority as part of the restructuring plan to enhance the services provided for pensioners. This came during a meeting with Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli, Minister of Social Solidarity Navina Qabbaj, Minister of Communications and Information Technology Amr Talat, the Presidential Advisor for Financial Affairs and the Head of the National Authority for Social Insurance. The President gave directives to maximize cooperation between the Social Insurance Authority and the Postal Service to provide better services for citizens. The meeting also covered the social educational programs and kindergartens. The President gave directives to issue temporary licenses for all unlicensed kindergartens, which numbered at about 10,000. Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli said that Egypt will not spare efforts to provide all support for South Sudan, showing readiness to establish the investment projects of top priority for the South Sudanese people. This came at a meeting held by Madbouli with South Sudan Irrigation Minister Manawa Peter, attended by Water Resources and Irrigation Minister Mohammed Abdel Ati. The Prime Minister gave his directives to speed up forming a joint Supreme Committee between the two countries and holding the first meeting in Cairo before the end of this year. On his side, the South Sudan Minister expressed appreciation of his country's leadership and government for Egypt's support during the crisis of the floods. He also asserted Juba's keenness on boosting cooperation with Cairo and benefiting from Egypt's special expertise in capacity building. And Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation Mohammed Abdel Ati said that Egypt will participate in the meeting, which was called upon by South Africa and will be attended by Ministers of Water and Foreign Affairs from Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia. The meeting will be held at the aim of launching negotiations over the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam as the talks stopped since last August. The minister reiterated that the meeting will discuss the outcomes of the African Union Baru Authority meetings. These were the main stories making the news today, and before we start talking about the Syrian crisis, let's check out this report regarding Foreign Minister Shoukry asserting and emphasizing that a political solution is necessary to solve the Syrian issue. In a ministerial meeting of the small group of Syria, Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry stressed the necessity of reaching a political solution in the war-torn country and warned against foreign interferences, especially from Turkey, which poses a threat to Syria and the whole region. Shoukry also stressed Egypt's deep concern over the destructive intervention of some regional forces in Syria, as well as the attempt to force demographic changes in Syria. Shoukry stated that these attempts should not affect reaching a final political solution that aims to keep the unity of Syria's territories and sovereignty in accordance with international resolutions. Egypt's top diplomat also asserted the importance of fighting against the danger of terrorist organizations, especially in northern Syria and Idlib, adding that the Turkish presence in Syria damages not only Syria itself, but the region as a whole. Shoukry added that the plans to spread radicalism and to transfer foreign terrorist fighters should not be tolerated. The foreign minister pointed out the need for the Syrian Negotiating Commission to develop a balanced formula that guarantees fair representation of the various opposition groups in the decision-making process, in a way that contributes to reaching a comprehensive political settlement to the Syrian crisis that has lasted for nearly 10 years and supports the ambition of the brotherly Syrian people to aspire towards a more stable future. The small group on Syria comprises Egypt, France, Germany, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UK and the US. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and joining us here in the studio is Ambassador Hamdi Saleh, the former Assistant Foreign Minister, to shed more light on this issue. Ambassador Saleh, thank you very much for joining us.
Delighted.
First off, Mr. Ambassador, how do you assess the meeting of the small group of the foreign ministers of the UK, the US, France, Germany, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, talking about the Syrian crisis right now?
This is a follow-up of the process. It has been a long process, like what you reported in your reports. The war in Syria has been going for a long time. And Egypt has a particular, very clear and precise stand to preserve the sovereignty of Syria, to preserve the unity of the Syrian territory, and to keep all forces, foreign forces out of the Syrian territory. So our participation in this particular group is important because we are emphasizing these issues and representing the Arab side with Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And in addition, trying to promote the concept of peace, like what the Foreign Minister Shukri had said. Basically, we are trying to really reach a political settlement for what's going on in Syria. Mm-hmm. The problem is that Syria has become now the battleground for the entire region, more or less. Part of it is now is Libya, but also Syria has been continuously becoming the battleground. And ironically, today in the morning, 80 people were killed by an attack from the Russian forces, Air Force, against what you call the El-Sham group, mm-hmm. which are supportive of Turkey, which is in revenge to, in revenge of what these people have done by sending their own mercenaries and their own people to fight in Armenia, against Armenia with Azerbaijan. So it is really, it's about time to say enough. And I think Egypt's position is that it's enough, that all this is a bloodshedding of the Syrian people is not really fair to anybody, neither to the Syrian people, nor to the Arab countries as a whole, nor to the world at large. Mm-hmm. Because basically the continuation of this conflict has been a nightmare for the entire region and for Europe, mm-hmm. and even for America. The illegal immigration, the suffering of the people who have been immigrating, the displaced groups and families, it's an entire tragedy, and I think Egypt is very much committed to ending this tragedy.
Yes. Well, Your Excellency, you're talking about this meeting. As you've mentioned, it is the latest in a series of meetings. The crisis has been going on for over 10 years. The Egyptian stance has always been the same, wanting the stability and security and sovereignty of Syria, the resumption of the governmental institutions to resume their work, de-arming all the militias, the extremist groups. It's been going on for 10 years. How are we expecting things to change 10 years on up until now?
We have been pushing for a change. The problem is that very little change has happened. It's more or less like an impasse, that the Turks are there, controlling part of Syria. The Russians are there. The militias are still continuing their own very malicious, work. And the bloodshedding is continuing. So the problem is that, we feel very much the tragedy, and we are committed to ending it. The problem is that, you have to move in so many levels. One, this is a problem which started as a local problem. It turned into a regional problem, and then now became international problem. So you have to move on the three levels of the internal and the regional and the international to try to resolve the problem. So on the local level, there is these discussions about how to build a constitutional system and so on, and to build a framework for a peaceful settlement among the factions which are really disagreeing with each other, particularly between the government and the opposition. Mm-hmm. And we are supportive of this process of really working out a constitutional framework. And also, we are supportive of the idea of trying to bring to bridge the gap between the opposition and the government, because we believe that the government in the final analysis has to establish itself as the main sovereign country, authority on the territory. And we believe that basically, unless there is an army, a national army, there would not be a state. And that's what we have seen in Libya, that's what we have seen in Yemen, and even in Iraq. When you don't have a political system, and you don't have an army and a security apparatus, there is no state. Mm-hmm. So we believe that we should move into this level of trying to bridge the gap between the factions there. But the second level is the regional, and that is the crux of the issue, because the Turkish incursion and the Iranians is really tremendous. It's unbelievable. Both of them, they believe that they have a part of the pie in Syria, and they try to control whatever they can. So the Iranians are not really that easy. They are trying even to change the ideological and the religious orientation of the people over there. The Turks are controlling parts of that, and they're playing also the card of the ethnic group and also of the factional group, and calling themselves the Sunni, the Sunni camp and so on. So that pushes into more the fragmentation of the society. Mm-hmm. And so that's on the regional level. Of course, you cannot ignore Israel and its interference, and you cannot ignore Hezbollah, which is really tied to Iran, and you cannot ignore money which is coming from Qatar and coming from other sources. So in the final analysis, the regional battle is going on. Egypt is not part of this. We have not put our hand in this. We try to stop that. We are really against the interference of foreign powers in the Syrian or in any Arab countries. But then comes the international level, where you come the bargaining between the Russians and the Americans on who will play the game, and the Americans have their own game to play. They left the Russians to try to stop things, but then apparently, my understanding that the Americans saw that it would be better for them to have the Turks confronting the Russians and to leave the scene and just to control the oil production area and so on. So as a result of that, we have three levels of confrontations. Mm-hmm. On the local and on the regional and the international, and Egypt is trying its own and utmost effort to try to push towards a peaceful settlement and to minimize the impact of these three levels on the Syrian society.
Yes. Your Excellency, you're mentioning the divisions between the factions within Syria, the government and the opposition, and you've also mentioned the foreign interferers within the country. Now, how hard is it now to really unite and eradicate these divisions, and should the small group, the ministerial virtual meeting, only focus on talking to the Syrian factions, or should they also include countries such as Russia and Turkey and all the other countries you've mentioned who are, if not even just present physically on the ground, they're present through funding and financing?
Look, we are talking about the first level, which you talked about, the factions within Syria itself. Now we have 10 years of bloodshedding, which means that there is what they call blood revenge among these people. I talked with so many Syrians in the United States who are immigrated to the United States, or they are really visiting, and to my astonishment, they are very much anti each other. It's not really an easy thing. You say, well, there is a blood revenge now. There is a heritage of hatred which is coming on. So to bridge the gap between the opposing factions is not an easy game. And that needs extensive efforts from the regional organizations, from the Syrians themselves, particularly the government, and from the international community. So that's a very important thing, because basically when you have a country which has been divided like this and torn among several factions, and they are really feeling sad bad against each other, that will be a place where you can get continuously terrorism, and the new generation does not have anything to do except to use force. And as a result of that, that will have a tremendous impact, very negative impact, on the region, on Syria itself, on the region, and then on the Mediterranean and above in the European scene. So that's the first question. I think there is a need for an extensive effort from the regional powers and the regional organizations, and also from the international community at large, to try to ease that tragedy and to try to relate to the problems which is going on, and to try to bridge the gap between the factions, and to try to also help the new generation, the young kids who are really suffering the most over there. No education, no food, nothing. It's really unbelievably tragedy, and nobody is really paying attention enough to the Syrian tragedy. We are talking about 6 or 7 million Syrians being displaced. At least 1 million of them immigrated to Europe.
Yes.
Several millions of them are living between Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, and other parts of the Arab world. So this is really a tragedy. A country by itself has been torn around and torn apart. So this is a major issue which I think facing the regional community and the international community. But to come back to what you said, that the part of the problem is the interference of the foreign powers. And the major problem coming from the two regional powers which I talked about, Turkey and Iran. Iran is really moving inside, trying to change the ideology of the country, and trying to Shiites, to make them Shia, and really to build schools and build institutions and so on. It's unbelievable, trying to change the entire nation into a more committed to their ideas and to their own philosophy and their own creed and so on. Turkey, on the other side, is controlling part of the country. It's unbelievable, and continuously invading this land and killing people and so on. As I mentioned today, has been a point of departure, turning point in this confrontation between the Russians and the Syrians, and the Russians and the Turks, by the fact that the Turks now have been sending their own groups from the Syrian mercenaries or Syrian young people who are giving them money in order to go to fight against Armenia. They say 2,000 of them have been sent. So the Russians now, they attacked this group, which is called Faylaq al-Sham, the Sham team, whatever you call it, Sham brigade, and they killed about 78 people out of them. This is a tragedy by itself. And openly they say, because we are trying to tell them, don't go to Azerbaijan, don't go to fight there. So Syria became like a prey to all these forces. Each is using it to its own benefit, and that's really the most ridiculous situation you can ever see.
Mr. Ambassador, do you think that maybe these divisions between the Syrian factions amongst themselves, they need to have some concessions among each other, and maybe the small ministerial group of these countries can actually try and replace or substitute the involvement of Turkey and Iran within Syria by working on the restructuring, the infrastructure of the country, and provide these developmental projects, and in that way they would be doing the positive work instead of having Turkey and Iran being involved and building schools and hospitals, as you've mentioned?
Look, in the final analysis, what really will change the scene is not really meetings of this committee and so on. These committees are useful. They are really exchanging views and trying to push some ideas and so on. But in the final analysis, it's really the international balance of power in general. And everybody is waiting for the American election to see what will be the American strategy towards the region. And also Russia is waiting, Turkey is waiting. And as a result of that, I don't think anything will happen in these 3 or 4 problems in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Libya, until the new balance of power will emerge after the American election, and we'll see who and what's going on. Now, the problem is, we are now witnessing a situation where in the past, the American foreign policy towards the region was really oblivious to these tragedies, and they really left them in an open air and so on. I think it is about time that there will be a clear strategy. What should we do? They encouraged Turkey to interfere in Libya. They encouraged Turkey to interfere in Syria. Now Turkey is really fighting on 5 or 6 fronts. I mean, it's unbelievable. Mr. Erdogan is really thinking himself the new Napoleon who is going to invade here and there and there. So as a result of that, Turkey is creating trouble for everybody. And they have problems with the Greeks, with Cyprus, with Armenia, with Syria, with Iraq, with everybody. And of course in Libya and so on. Was that by a green light from the Trump administration? It's a question mark. But is now the American policy is not really very happy with this, particularly with the movement of the Turks in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think what you are talking about, the idea of starting a strategy to rebuild Syria and to rehabilitate these people, the young generation and the displaced people and so on, that needs a real decision from the international community, basically from the United States, Russia and the Europeans, and a commitment from the regional groups, with particularly Egypt, Syria, and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates and the Gulf in general, and also a commitment from the Syrians to try to change what they have, because this is a tragedy which cannot continue.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the foreign ministers of the small group actually issued a statement, a joint statement regarding their meeting and where they stand regarding the Syrian crisis. Let's check out this report and we'll be right back. Based on an Egyptian stance affirming the necessity of reaching a political solution to the Syrian crisis, Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry stressed the determinants of the Egyptian position regarding the Syrian crisis. To that end, wrapping up the Syria Small Group virtual ministerial meeting, the foreign ministers of Egypt, France, Germany, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom and the United States issued a joint statement stating that they continue to strongly support a political resolution of the Syrian crisis on the basis of the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. They support the efforts of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, to move forward with the political process, adding that a political solution as set out in the UNSCR 2254 is the only way to bring a sustainable peace, stability and security to the Syrian people, and would facilitate the withdrawal of all foreign forces that came into Syria after 2011. They noted that such solution must preserve the territorial integrity, unity and sovereignty of Syria. The members also said that they took note of the Constitutional Committee's launch in 2019, and they urged continued engagement with the committee to ensure substantial progress on the discussion of the Constitution in line with the committee's mandate and procedures. We stand behind Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to convene the 4th round of meetings, which must discuss substantial issues in order to achieve meaningful process. Steps should be made to advance all of the other dimensions of the political process, including towards the convening of UN-supervised free and fair elections in a safe and neutral environment as outlined in the UNSCR 2254, in which internally displaced persons, refugees and their diaspora must be able to participate. The statement further said that after almost 10 years of conflict, the people of Syria have suffered deeply, where hundreds of thousands have been killed and millions forcibly displaced. Now facing COVID-19 and continued economic difficulties, the Syria Small Group noted that they want to highlight again the importance of providing safe and unhindered humanitarian access for all Syrians currently in need of it, including areas where conditions are noticeably deteriorating, as in Idlib province and South Syria. They also urged the international community to continue supporting Syrian refugees and their hosting countries and communities until Syrians can voluntarily return home in safety, dignity and security. The members reiterated that they oppose forced demographic change and commit to disperse no assistance for any resettlement of Syrian refugees that is not in line with the UNHCR standards. They stress that there is no military solution that will bring peace, security and stability to Syria, reiterating their commitment to the enduring defeat of the Daesh terrorist group and other UN-recognized terrorist groups throughout Syria. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, continuing our discussion with Ambassador Saleh. Mr. Ambassador, it seems that there are a lot of similarities between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Libya. Almost pretty similar scenarios, pretty similar foreign interferers in this region. Do you feel that they're both directly dependent on what happens in the country next door or not?
Let me first comment on what has been mentioned in your reports. The three main points which I really emphasize in this report. First one is that the ministers and our minister in particular emphasized the importance of the role of the United Nations.
Yes.
And the envoy, the United Nations envoy. We hope that he will be able to achieve something because, you know, the United Nations envoy has been there for the last 8 years or so. Continuously they change and so on, and they have not been effective. So there is a real hope that somehow the United Nations can really move the process forward and not only keep playing the role of an observer like that. Related to that is the idea that, or the principle that, all foreign powers should get out of Syria. And that also has not been achieved at all. Everybody is talking about it, but the forces, the Iranian forces are there, the Turkish forces are there, other forces, of course, the Americans are there, Russians are there. I mean, it's unbelievable, and you don't know. Maybe there is other forces which we don't even know, the French, the British, and so on. There is some, what you call special groups, so special operations forces and so on. In addition to the continuous aggression of the Israelis by airplanes and so on. So the second principle, which is to try to keep all foreign powers outside of the Syrian territory, is not really being taken seriously. And that is a very important principle which Egypt has been upholding for some time. And I think it's about time again to push this principle to the front of the issue and to waiting for the 3rd of November with the American election to make it clear that now it's about time that the American strategy and the Russian strategy should really be clear about what they should do, not to really fight their own battles on the territory of Syria, but to try to ease the tragedy. The third issue, which was mentioned in your report, is the humanitarian problem. It's a crisis. It's a real humanitarian issue, that the displaced, the refugees, and so on. And everybody is really commercializing the issue. Particularly Mr. Erdogan is really using it as a game. Continuously, they are trying to play games with the Europeans, saying, well, if you don't do that for me, then I will let the refugees come to your countries and so on. This is ridiculous. This is really a sad tragedy that a country like Turkey is playing the game of the refugees and so on, and illegal immigrations against other countries, and instead of calling on the world community at large to try to ease that tragedy and the sufferings of these people, the displaced, the refugees, and the underprivileged, and privileged and the poor. It's unbelievable. So the humanitarian issue in particular needed to be addressed quickly, because this will have an impact on everybody in Europe and in America, because basically when you have a big generation of the young people, of the Syrian young generation, living in despair like this, they will end up in a situation where they will get into terrorism and getting into violence and so on. Unless you really do something, these people have been suffering. So it's about time that the world community, particularly the United Nations, should take a more active role in building a framework and an institution and a process to ease this humanitarian tragedy and crisis. Now, to come back to your point, the comparison between Syria and Libya, it's as you said, it's the same scenario, but with a different parameters, because Libya is a smaller country, smaller in terms of population, but bigger in terms of space. But it is the same scenario. It's the same thing. It's a local issue which really emerged into a little bit, expanded a little bit into semi-regional, and then become regional, become international. And again, the Turks are playing the same role. You know, the Americans give them the green light to try to confront the Russians over there. And as a result of that, the real victim is the Libyan people and the Libyan territory. And Libya now is divided. And, you know, we have been working with them in order to unite them. And Egypt has done enormous effort to try to bring all the Libyan faction into really putting together a more reasonable framework for their own political future and so on. Particularly what they have done in Gardaga, in meetings, and on Geneva, and in meetings in Cairo. But the scenario has been continuing. You know, the Turks are continuing their own interference, and they control now certain bases, military bases in Libya. They send the mercenaries and they continue to send the arms. And people talk about that they should stop that, and nothing happens. And the Europeans, are taking one step forward and one step backward, and you don't know exactly where Europe stands. The division within Europe makes the Europeans unable to make a real strategy. And as a result of that, Turkey is benefiting from this and using this. It was only because of the Egyptian stand to say that you have a red light here, red line, where you cannot really cross, that, because of that, Turkey could really have been pushing its own militia all the way to the borders of Egypt. And, making Libya as a whole as a battlefront for the militias fighting each other and so on. Because whatever Turkey will do, in the final analysis, look at the picture, what's happening in the eastern and western part of Libya. Factions are fighting each other, killing each other. So what are you going to do? You are going to try to make all Libya like this? So we are witnessing another tragedy on a smaller scale, but it's almost like the Syrians. And Libyans as well have been displaced and kicked out of their country and losing lives and so on.
Yes. Well, regarding the humanitarian issue, they're talking about supplying the humanitarian aid to Syria round the clock, and they're working on that. But as you've mentioned, the issue of the exodus of the foreign powers within Syria, what does it take? Would it take just diplomacy, or do you see any sort of military intervention or involvement by the international community in Syria to force the exodus of these foreign powers? Is that an option on the table?
First, let me say that the humanitarian assistance is not enough. There is a lot of effort, you are right, but it's not really focused enough, and it's not institutionalized enough to be able to relieve a situation which became extremely bad, a real tragedy. Particularly in the northern part of Syria, Idlib and so on, where the Turks are really, bombarding the cities over there and killing so many people. People are really suffering tremendously, and the humanitarian assistance is not really enough. And when you look into the picture clearly, it's too bad that because when the crisis continues for 10 years, people start to take it as an easy thing. It's a part of the routine life that people will suffer like a routine issue. No, you cannot do that in the 21st century. I think there is a need for an international effort to build an institutional process to really help these people. And my concern is that the young generation who only witnessed war, did not go to school, and did not have enough food, these young people will be a bad element in their own society, in their own region, and so on. And we witnessed that. We witnessed that some of them have been used by Turkey to be sent as mercenaries to Libya, and now they are sending them to Azerbaijan, and everybody is using them because they did not know enough to build for themselves their own country. So that's number one. The humanitarian issue is a very important issue in Syria and later in Libya, and later also in Yemen. But we need to really take that into consideration, and the United Nations has a major responsibility for that. If the ministerial meeting was talking about the envoy, the envoy should really write a report on the humanitarian issue with the other agencies of the United Nations, and to see to what extent what they have accomplished and what could be accomplished in the future. Now, to come back about to take away or to push the foreign forces outside of Syria, this is a very complicated process. This is a process which you have to deal with. To what extent that the Iranians have very, close relations with the government, with the current government in Syria. And the current government in Syria is saying that the Iranians are really our allies and so on, and they are allowing them to take positions everywhere. So how can you really make free the Syrian government from this trap of being really being beholden to the Iranians? Now that's one thing, but the second thing, because you have Iranian militias everywhere, and they are now building schools to teach Persian language and to teach the Shia creed and so on. They are changing the landscape. They are changing the composition of the population. Now we have another element, which is Turks. The Turks now playing the card of the Sunni. We are here at the Sunni forces, and they are having this northern part of Syria, Idlib, and so on, and continuously there is conflict, and they are cultivating the militias which are supporting them, and as I said, we talked about the Faylaq al-Sham. Now we have, in addition to that, money coming from Qatar to cultivate these groups, which with Turkey, basically. Then you have another major problem with the fact which is Syria is very much linked to Lebanon. And in Lebanon you have a power which has been there, nobody knows exactly how to fit it. Is it a state, non-state? Is it what? Hezbollah. How do you call it? What is this? It's a political entity which has military force, and it has leadership, and it has broadcasting, and it has everything. Is it a state within a state? It's unbelievable. And the crisis of Lebanon by itself is a result of what Hezbollah has been doing for some time. And Hezbollah is interfering in Syria. So the interlinking between Syrian problems and the Lebanon problem is very, very complex. You cannot really separate it that easily. How we can contain Hezbollah, how we can contain the problem of Hezbollah within Lebanon and within Syria it's a question mark. The Americans have been talking with everybody about boycotting Hezbollah and putting it as a terrorist group. I don't know to what extent that will be effective. To a large extent, the American strategy, the French strategy, was not really effective enough, neither in Lebanon nor in Syria. And that's one of the problems, that it's not clear. It is not clear what they wanted to do, and they are not effective as well, because they don't have a clear strategy. And I think to get the foreign forces out, you need the world community, the international balance of power, inclined towards pushing them out. If they are committed, I think they can do that.
Your Excellency, you've mentioned a few times that a lot of what's happening really depends or is waiting to the US elections, which is in 8 days' time. Now, whether Trump wins a second term or Joe Biden becomes the next US president, how do you see things changing in Syria, if changing at all?
In Syria in particular?
Particularly in Syria.
Let me say first that foreign issues are not a major issue in the American election, in any American election, not only this one. American election is based basically on the preference for the domestic issues, health insurance, Obamacare, the problems of that. What the average man is really facing every day in America, which is really is the price of oil is going up, is the price of this, so this what really will affect very much the results of the election. Particularly now we have two major problems facing the American community, the US community at large, which is the COVID-19 and how to deal with the epidemics. And the second problem is the ethnic and the racial problems, which really have been rising in the last few months and so on. So these are the issues which will put the framework for the election. And let me come back to the point whether there will be, if there is a change in the administration, that will change the American policy towards the region, and I don't think so. American policy towards the region is basically what you call it, a matter of national security. And national security does not change with the administration. It is really there is institutions which build a certain framework, and whenever the president comes, here is the framework. This what protects our security. That's what we are going to do, and he has a margin of choice. Basically, continuously there is now a trend towards minimizing the cost for American forces and American interference abroad. From Obama, the Democrats, to Trump, the Republican, to whoever is coming after that, they will continue that trend to minimize their involvement abroad, militarily, economically, and politically. But the point is, there is an issue now that this will affect their own national security, and it will affect the European national security. And with this last problem in France, with this issue of them killing and whatever problems is facing France now with the Muslim community and the utterness of Mr. Macron and so on, I think this an issue is becoming very, very volatile, and they need to look at it very seriously, what to do with the region. And they cannot leave the region to violence like this and to this type of anarchy. They participated in making this situation, by the way. They contributed to that. The Americans, the Russians, the Europeans, they contributed to this. Because basically, one of the problems with the American foreign policy is that it is short-sighted at a certain point. Like what they have done in Afghanistan, they supported the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen came back to hit at them in New York. So maybe they have done some of these mistakes again in Syria, and they did it again in Iraq, and they did it again in Libya. It's about time they look into a wider perspective and to take a stand where they can really stop terrorism and stop violence, and to really create certain kind of what you call political community to help these countries to build their own political community, which is a stable political system and more consistent with the 21st century.
Mr. Ambassador, so if it's not the next US president who is determined or change any strategy regarding the region, do you feel that it really comes down to where the European community and the US administration, where does the international community stand regarding the Turkish interference, the Iranian interference, the Russian involvement? So it comes down to how are they coping, or if they are confronting each other, or they reach a deadlock. So it really depends on this sort of relation, and then as a domino effect, it would affect Iraq, Libya, and Syria?
Look, what I meant is that, basically the US and the US foreign policy was starting a trend. They really moved, the Trump administration moved into containing the Iranian threat, the Iranian interference, and they really took a very strong stand against Iran, making sanctions and so on. But they played the game with Turkey, allowing Turkey to interfere in Syria and in Libya. Apparently they learned the lesson now, because Turkey was not that helpful. Turkey became really like a gendarme or whatever, they call it in Syria, in the Syrian abadai, like a power which is thinks that it has no limits, and they play the games everywhere. So because the Trump administration was now getting into the election season, so they did not really formulate a policy to really deal with that. They were very much involved with the domestic issues, and they tried to contain the issues. Suddenly we find the American policy more active in Libya and pushed into the process, the peace process and so on, because they don't want, the Trump administration does not want to face question, you did not do enough in this. They also tried to contain a little bit the problem in Lebanon. They tried to contain the problem in Iraq. They did little with Syria, but in the final analysis, it was too late for them to really formulate a policy. I think what is going to happen, whether the Trump administration will continue or the Biden administration will emerge, is that in the final analysis there will be a new strategy, and the strategy based on what they learned from the last 4 years, and that new strategy might be very helpful.
And that new strategy will be depending on what? Oil production, demographic changes?
No. I mean, this is what you call the typical cliches of the Middle Eastern analysis. America has only three: oil and Israel, and so no. America has a strategy to protect its own security, and they really look at terrorism and violence as a major threat to their own security, and that's what we need to emphasize to them. That also that basically what's going on in Syria will impact on you. What's going on in Libya, what's going on in Yemen. This the world becomes very small, too small to try to be distant from violence and say, well, let them kill each other. So I think the new strategy will be based on how to contain these conflicts, how to help these countries to establish a political system, but also try to kick, the what you call the antagonists, like the Iranians and so on, out. Israel, of course, is very aggressive in this and doing that. But in the final analysis, I think there will be a change in the American strategy to be more active in, not by spending money or sending forces, but in trying to contain these conflicts and try to stabilize the situation.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, definitely the Syrian issue is only one of multiple issues taking place within the Middle East and the Arab region. Egypt made its stance quite clear, be it in the participation of the small ministerial group or other venues and committees. And we're going to be following up all these developments taking place here on Nile TV International. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight's show. I'd like to thank my guest, Ambassador Hamdi Saleh, the former Assistant Foreign Minister, for his insight. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for more coming up on Nile International. I'm Hani Saif. Thank you for joining us.